HOA Karen calls 911-0N my son that he's too young to own his house. Didn't know who he is. Maybe it was the pristine lawns or the meticulously trimmed hedges that first caught your eye. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight danced off the perfectly polished windows of each immaculate home. But behind the facade of this picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, a storm was brewing. From the moment my son moved in, something felt off. At first, it was just a feeling, a nagging sensation at the back of my mind. But as days turned into weeks, it became impossible to ignore the watchful eyes that seemed to follow his every move. You see, my son had always dreamed of a quiet place to call home. After years of living in a bustling, noisy part of town, he finally decided to take my advice and buy a house in my neighborhood. It should have been a fresh start, a chance to relax and enjoy the peace he'd been craving. But instead, he found himself thrust into the center of a neighborhood drama that would soon spiral out of control. At the heart of this unfolding saga was Karen, a woman whose very name had become synonymous with meddling and self-righteousness in our community. From the moment my son's moving truck pulled up, Karen's curtains never seemed to stop twitching. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion every time he left for work, every time he returned home, even when he simply stepped out to check the mail. It started small, a complaint about the color of his new mailbox, a passive-aggressive note about the height of his grass. But as time went on, Karen's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. She began timing his comings and goings, jotting down notes in a little black book she always seemed to have on hand. One day, I caught her peeking over the fence, camera in hand, as my son chatted with a colleague in his backyard. When confronted, she mumbled something about maintaining neighborhood standards before scurrying back to her house. The situation reached a fever pitch when my son decided to host a small housewarming gathering. As his friends arrived, Karen emerged from her house, clipboard in hand, demanding to see permits for the event. When my son politely explained it was just a casual get-together, her eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that," she hissed before storming off. The next day, a formal complaint was filed with the Homeowners Association, citing noise violations and suspicious activity. My son, bewildered and frustrated, tried to reason with Karen to understand her concerns, but his attempts at diplomacy fell on deaf ears. As the weeks wore on, the tension in the neighborhood became palpable. Other neighbors, once friendly, began to avoid eye contact. Whispers followed my son as he walked down the street. It seemed that Karen's campaign of suspicion was gaining traction, slowly poisoning the community against the newcomer in their midst. Little did Karen know, she was about to learn a valuable lesson about judging books by their covers. The young man she had deemed too young, too different to belong in her precious neighborhood was about to turn her world upside down. But before we dive deeper into this gripping tale of prejudice and redemption, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced discrimination in your own neighborhood? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey so far, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more eye-opening true stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this suburban showdown. Picture this: a quiet, affluent, suburban area where the lawns are always perfectly manicured, and the houses look like they've jumped straight out of a magazine. This isn't just any neighborhood. It's the kind of place where success seems to seep from every pristine sidewalk. The Homeowners Association here isn't just strict, it's practically a governing body. Their rules cover everything from the acceptable shade of white for your picket fence to how many inches your grass can grow before it's deemed unkempt. It's the kind of place where conformity isn't just expected, it's enforced. Now, let me tell you about my son. He's a good kid, always has been. He used to live in one of those bustling parts of town where the noise never stops, and peace is a luxury you can't afford. But he'd recently been appointed as the youngest police chief in our city's history. Can you believe it? My boy, making history. So, when he complained about the constant racket in his old neighborhood, I suggested he come to my neck of the woods. It's quiet here, I told him. Perfect for a young man on the rise. Little did I know what we were in for. Enter Karen. Now, I don't like to speak ill of my neighbors, but this woman, she's something else. She's got a history of complaints longer than the list of HOA regulations. And let me tell you, that's saying something. Karen's made it her personal mission to maintain neighborhood standards. But between you and me, Her version of standards seems to involve a whole lot of racial profiling and unnecessary 911 calls. It's like she's appointed herself the neighborhood watchdog, but instead of watching for actual trouble, she's on high alert for anyone who doesn't fit her idea of who belongs here. When my son bought his house, he was over the moon. You should have seen him, grinning from ear to ear as he talked about finally having a place to call his own. At first, things seemed great. The neighbors were friendly, coming over with welcome baskets and invitations to backyard barbecues. But then Karen noticed. I saw her curtains twitching every time my son left for work. She'd be out walking her dog, if you can call standing in one spot for an hour walking every time he came home. It was like she was keeping tabs on him, building some sort of case in that busy little mind of hers. As the days went by, her surveillance got more obvious. She started timing his comings and goings, jotting things down in a little notebook. I even caught her trying to peer over his fence one day, camera in hand. Now, I ask you, what could possibly drive someone to call the police on their new neighbor without provocation? What kind of person sees a young man minding his own business in his own home and decides he's a threat? Stay tuned, folks, because let me tell you, this story, it's about to take a turn that'll have you shaking your head in disbelief. As the weeks went by, Karen's behavior became increasingly erratic. It seemed like every day brought a new complaint about some trivial matter. One day, it was the color of my son's curtains. Next, it was the positioning of his recycling bin. "Can you believe it?" my son would say to me, shaking his head in disbelief. "She actually filed a formal complaint because my grass was half an inch too long." Despite the constant barrage of petty grievances, my son tried his best to maintain peace. He'd wave politely when he saw Karen, even as she scowled back. He adjusted his routines, hoping to minimize conflict. But it seemed the more he tried to keep to himself, the more Karen's suspicions grew. Before long, the HOA started issuing warnings based on Karen's reports. It was clear that her influence was spreading, poisoning the well of community goodwill. The situation came to a head on a quiet Sunday afternoon. My son had just returned from a jog when I saw Karen marching purposefully towards her house, phone in hand. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. Sure enough, within minutes, police sirens could be heard in the distance. As they grew closer, I could see the confusion on my son's face. He stepped outside, still in his running clothes, just as two police cruisers pulled up. "That's him," Karen's shrill voice cut through the air. "That suspicious young man, he's far too young to own a house in this neighborhood. He must be up to something illegal." The officers approached cautiously, hands on their holsters. "Sir," one of them called out, "we've received a report of suspicious activity. Can you please identify yourself?" What happened next was something I'll never forget. My son, cool as a cucumber, reached into his pocket, but instead of a driver's license, he pulled out a badge. "Officer," he said calmly, "I'm Chief Johnson. I believe we met at last week's departmental meeting." The look on the officers' faces was priceless. They immediately straightened up, hands flying from their holsters to their foreheads in crisp salutes. "Chief, we had no idea, sir. We're so sorry for the disturbance." As for Karen, well, I've never seen someone's face turn so many shades of red in such a short time. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no sound coming out. The officers, to their credit, tried to defuse the situation. They apologized profusely to my son and assured Karen that there was no cause for concern, but the damage was done. The entire neighborhood had come out to witness the spectacle, and Karen's credibility was in tatters. As the police cars drove away and the neighbors dispersed, whispering among themselves, I couldn't help but wonder, how would you react if you discovered the person you reported to the police was actually in charge of law enforcement? It's a question that I'm sure kept Karen up that night, and many nights after. Stay tuned, folks. This story isn't over yet. The fallout from this incident would reshape our little community in ways none of us could have predicted. The neighborhood was in an uproar after the incident. Word spread like wildfire, and suddenly, Karen's credibility was in tatters. People who had once nodded along to her complaints were now shaking their heads in disbelief. The HOA board, realizing the gravity of the situation, called an emergency meeting. They issued a formal apology to my son, acknowledging the unfounded nature of the complaints and the inappropriate escalation to law enforcement. They also announced a comprehensive review of their complaint procedures. promising to implement safeguards against potential abuse or discrimination. As for Karen, well, you've never seen someone backpedal so fast. She tried to play it off as a misunderstanding, even attempting to bring over a plate of cookies as a peace offering. But the damage was done. Her once powerful influence in the neighborhood had evaporated overnight. My son, ever the professional, took the high road. He used the incident as a teachable moment, organizing a community forum to discuss racial profiling and age-based discrimination. He shared his thoughts on the experience, emphasizing how assumptions and prejudices can lead to dangerous situations. "This incident isn't just about me," he told the gathered neighbors. "It's about the countless individuals who face similar prejudices every day, often without the protection of a badge or the platform to speak out." The community dialogue that followed was eye-opening. Longtime residents shared their own experiences with prejudice, while others admitted to biases they hadn't previously recognized. It was a difficult but necessary conversation that laid bare the work still needed to create a truly inclusive community. In the weeks that followed, we saw real changes in our neighborhood. The HOA implemented new training programs for board members and residents, focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They also established a community advisory board to provide input on neighborhood policies and events. My son's impact extended beyond our little corner of the world. He used his position as police chief to implement new community policing initiatives, emphasizing relationship building and trust between law enforcement and residents. He organized Coffee with a Cop events, bringing officers and community members together in informal settings to foster understanding and open dialogue. The incident that could have torn our community apart instead became a catalyst for positive change. It wasn't always easy, and there were certainly bumps along the way. But slowly, surely, we began to see a shift in the neighborhood's culture. As I reflect on this journey, I can't help but wonder, what lessons can we all learn from this incident to create more inclusive communities? It's a question that continues to drive our neighborhood's ongoing efforts to be better, to do better for all our residents. As I wrap up this story, I can't help but feel a mix of emotions. Pride in my son for handling such a difficult situation with grace and turning it into an opportunity for positive change. Sadness that such prejudices still exist in our society. And hope that by sharing this story, we can inspire others to make a difference in their own communities. Now, I want to turn to you, the viewer. This isn't just a story to be passively consumed. It's a call to action. I challenge each and every one of you to take a hard look at your own biases. We all have them, whether we like to admit it or not. The question is, what are we going to do about them? Start by asking yourself some tough questions. Have you ever made assumptions about someone based on their age, race, or appearance? Have you ever felt out of place in your own neighborhood? How can you contribute to making your community more welcoming and inclusive for everyone? Remember, change starts with individual actions. It could be as simple as introducing yourself to a new neighbor, speaking up when you witness discrimination, or getting involved in local community initiatives. Every small step counts towards creating a more inclusive society. As we've seen from this experience, appearances can be deceiving. The young man that Karen saw as a threat turned out to be the very person responsible for keeping our community safe. It's a powerful reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover. In closing, I want to leave you with this thought. Imagine a world where everyone is given the benefit of the doubt, where communities come together to support and uplift each other, rather than tear each other down. That's the kind of world I want to live in, and I believe with conscious effort and open hearts, we can make it a reality. Thank you for listening to our story. If it resonated with you, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with others who might benefit from hearing this message. And most importantly, take what you've learned here and apply it in your own life and community.